Welcome to the Science of Hockey, the podcast where we break down the science behind ice hockey. I'm the analyst, your host, and every week we explore the data, research, and evidence that shape how we play, train, and understand the game of hockey. From biomechanics to performance psychology, we take you beyond the rink and into the research lab, giving you insights that go beyond hearsay and into what really makes the difference on the ice. Whether you're a player, a coach, a parent, or just someone passionate about the sport, we're here to bring you scientifically backed information in a language that's friendly and easy to understand. So grab your skates and let's dive into the science of hockey. Hello, hockey enthusiasts. This is the Science of Hockey, and I'm the analyst. In this episode, we explore the unique demands placed on defensemen and forwards in pro hockey. From heart rates to game pacing, discover how these insights can shape future training and tactics.
All right, so are you ready to dive into this research on fatigue in pro hockey?
Absolutely. I'm really excited to dig into this.
Yeah, this should be interesting. We're going to be looking at a study from the Journal of Human Kinetics. And what's really cool about this is they used wearable tech to track players during actual NHL games.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
It's like having a front row seat to all the action. You can see like every movement, every check, every stride.
It's amazing what technology can do these days, right?
It really is. And this is giving researchers like such a detailed picture of what's actually happening on the ice. It's not just like theory anymore. It's real data.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
This particular study, they were really interested in creating these, what they called game activity profiles.
Game activity profiles.
Yeah, basically they wanted to map out, how much work players are doing, what kind of work they're doing, and how that changes throughout the game.
So like, are they mostly skating hard? Are they doing more short bursts, that kind of thing?
Exactly, yeah. They looked at things like accelerations, decelerations, all those little details that add up.
Gotcha. And then did they also look at how like player positions and things like fitness level impact fatigue?
That's right. They wanted to see how all these different pieces of the puzzle fit together,
Yeah, because when I think about hockey, like I think about those intense 60 minutes. You've got the speed, the physicality, the constant back and forth. I just assume that those players are totally wiped by that third period.
Right. You would think that, wouldn't you?
Totally. Like I can barely make it up the stairs after like 2 periods of watching it on TV,
Mm-hmm.
So did the study actually find that like players are just completely drained by the end?
Well, that's where things get a little bit surprising.
Oh.
You might expect to see this like clear decline in performance like as the game goes on, but that's not really what they found. In fact, the study didn't show a significant drop in performance in the third period.
Hold on. So you're telling me those players aren't completely exhausted after 2 periods of like intense hockey? Yeah. How is that even possible?
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, remember, we're talking about like elite athletes here. They've trained for years and they know how to manage their energy better than anyone.
Yeah, that's true.
The study points to a few reasons why fatigue might not be as obvious as we'd think. For one thing, the third period actually has more built-in recovery time.
Oh, that's interesting.
You've got things like penalties, timeouts.
So even though those breaks might only be like a minute or 2 at a time.
Yeah, even those short little breaks can be enough to let players catch their breath and kind of reset,
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
But it's not just about those stoppages in play. The study also talked about how players, they strategically pace themselves throughout the game. They're not just going all out constantly.
That's interesting. So it's more like they're choosing their moments and conserving energy for when it really matters.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, if you think about it, they're kind of like endurance athletes on skates. Marathon runners, they know when to push the pace and when to conserve energy.
I like that analogy, yeah.
It's all about strategy.
So did this study actually show like evidence of this pacing strategy?
They did. They found that players who spent more time on the ice actually performed fewer accelerations and decelerations per minute.
Wait, so the more they play, the less they're going all out on those like bursts of speed. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But it's a classic sign of pacing yourself. Instead of going full throttle every shift, they're being smart about when to use that energy,
So it's kind of like they're picking their battles.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Now, you mentioned that the researchers also looked at differences between player positions. They focused on forwards and defensemen, right?
Right.
Did they find any like differences in their game activity profiles?
They did, and this is where it gets really interesting. The study found that defensemen actually experience greater physical demands than forwards.
Really, I always thought it was the other way around. Like the forwards are the ones always flying up and down the ice trying to score goals.
Right. It seems like they'd be doing more work, but when you break it down, it's the defensemen who are constantly engaged in these short bursts of really intense activity. Blocking shots, battling in front of the net, constantly changing direction. It's a lot of starting and stopping, which takes a toll on the body.
So even though the forwards might cover more distance overall, it's those defensive movements that make it so physically demanding.
Yeah, that's what the research suggests.
Yeah.
Forwards, they have more opportunities to glide and recover during those runs, but defensemen are always in the thick of it.
So much for thinking defense was the easier position, huh?
Right.
But hold on, you said that defensemen experience greater physical demands overall.
Right, but there's a catch.
Okay.
When you factor in their time on the ice, those demands per minute are actually pretty similar to forwards.
Oh, so they're doing more overall, but when you account for ice time, it evens out.
Exactly, yeah. It suggests that coaches are strategically managing ice time based on, the specific demands of each position.
So maybe they're giving defensemen slightly shorter shifts because they know they're working harder in those shorter bursts?
That's likely part of it, yeah. It's all about balancing the workload, even though the types of movements and the overall demands are different.
That makes sense. So what about fitness level? You mentioned earlier that the researchers looked at the link between fitness and game performance.
Right, they did. And this was another interesting finding. They found that there wasn't a strong correlation between a player's fitness level and how hard they worked during a game.
Wait a minute. So you're saying that like a super fit player doesn't necessarily work harder during the game than someone who's maybe not in as good of shape?
Yeah, it's kind of surprising, right?
You would think like the better shape you're in, the more you can do out there on the ice.
You'd think so, but the researchers have an interesting theory about this. They think that coaches might actually give their fitter players longer shifts because they know those players can handle it.
So like a super fit player might be on the ice longer, but maybe they're pacing themselves more, making their overall work rate kind of similar to a less fit player who's having shorter shifts.
That's the idea. It's another way that coaches are trying to optimize performance,
So it's all about strategy, even when it comes to fitness levels. This is blowing my mind. I'm already rethinking everything I thought I knew about fatigue in hockey. And we've only just scratched the surface.
I know, right? There's so much more to unpack here.
I'm already looking forward to part 2.
Me too. Welcome back. Are you ready for more?
I am, definitely. There were some pretty surprising findings in that last part. Like, one thing I'm still kind of curious about is how the researchers actually, measured fatigue during the games. It's not like they could just, skate up to a player mid-shift and be like, hey, how tired are you?
Yeah, right. It's not exactly easy to get a direct measurement of fatigue in the middle of a game,
Yeah. It's a fast-paced sport. So instead, they focused on what they called those game activity profiles, remember?
Right.
Those gave them a bunch of data on how the players were moving throughout the game. Things like, the number of accelerations and decelerations, stuff like that.
So like those bursts of speed and those sudden stops, especially for those defensemen that we talked about, that's got to take a toll on the body, right?
Exactly. And to get an even better picture, they also tracked the players' heart rates throughout the game. So by combining all these different measurements, they could see how fatigue was impacting performance.
Okay, so it was more about looking for those subtle signs and patterns rather than, some big obvious drop-off.
Exactly, yeah.
Because we talked about how the study didn't find that, players were performing worse in the third period.
Right. They didn't see a huge drop-off, but they did notice some smaller changes in certain metrics as the game went on.
That were, for example, the forwards had a slight decrease in the number of intense decelerations per minute, in the second period.
Oh, interesting. So maybe they were kind of easing up a bit on those sudden stops?
Possibly. It's possible that those short breaks between shifts, even though they're quick, maybe they're enough for them to manage those high-intensity movements a little bit better.
So every little bit of recovery helps, I guess.
Seems like it, yeah.
Earlier you mentioned muscle glycogen, I think it was, and how that's kind of like fuel for the muscles, right?
Right. Glycogen is essential for energy. especially during intense exercise like hockey. And the study mentioned that past research has shown like a pretty significant depletion of muscle glycogen by the end of a game.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And as players work harder, their body temperature also goes up and dehydration becomes a factor too.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot for the body to handle. Even if they're not, showing big, obvious signs of fatigue, their bodies are definitely working hard.
Absolutely. And it's also important to remember that fatigue, it can like show up in different ways for different players.
Oh, right. Yeah. Good.
So, like some guys might have their performance decline. Other guys might just feel really sore,
Right. Or maybe even mental fatigue, just not being as sharp mentally.
Exactly. Yeah. There's so many factors at play.
Did the researchers look into how fatigue might affect those different positions differently, given those different demands we talked about?
They did. And while it's tough to draw definitive conclusions, they noticed that the frequency of substitutions seemed to play a role in mitigating fatigue, especially when it came to heart rate.
Oh, so if a coach is regularly swapping players in and out, it could help keep their heart rates from getting too high.
Right. Especially for those positions that demand a lot of quick bursts, like defensemen.
It's kind of like those strategic timeouts in basketball, to disrupt the other team's momentum. Coaches are using those substitutions to help their players manage their energy levels.
It's all about strategy. Now, we talked about some limitations of the study before. You want to go over those again?
Yeah, sure. So this study was really insightful, don't get me wrong.
Right.
But there were a few things to keep in mind, right? Like one of the biggest ones was the sample size, I think.
Yeah, they only looked at one pro team.
And every team is different, right?
Yeah.
Some teams play a more aggressive style. Others are more, defensive-minded.
Exactly.
So you can't necessarily apply these findings to every team in the league.
Right. And they were also limited by the fact that they couldn't directly measure things like muscle fatigue or how much effort the player felt like they were given.
Right. So they had to rely on those indirect measurements, like changes in their movement patterns and heart rate, which is still useful. But
it doesn't tell the whole story.
And the last one was that they were mainly focused on those accelerations and decelerations, right?
Right. So they got great data on those short bursts of activity, but they didn't really track the overall distances players covered at different speeds,
And that can contribute to fatigue too, right?
Exactly, yeah. So while this study gives us a great start, there's still a lot more we can learn.
It sounds like it, yeah. This has been so interesting. I'm ready to hear what else you have to say about all this.
Okay.
Okay, so we've spent all this time talking about this research, and I think I'm starting to get it.
Yeah.
But where do we go from here? What does it all mean for the future of hockey?
Right. A great question. I think one of the big takeaways for me is that fatigue in hockey, it's not, as straightforward as we might think.
Yeah, definitely not.
Like, we tend to assume players are just getting more and more tired as the game goes on.
Yeah, I did.
But this study shows it's way more complex than that. These guys, they're elite athletes.
Yeah.
They know how to pace themselves. They use those little breaks, those recovery periods to manage their energy, and it's really impressive.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it makes you appreciate how much strategy is involved. It's not just about being strong and fast. It's about being smart, too.
Absolutely. And I think this research has some pretty big implications for how we think about training and recovery. Like in the past, a lot of approaches have been kind of one size fits all.
Yeah.
But this research suggests that, maybe we need to be more individualized. Look at how each player fatigues and come up with strategies specific to them.
So like personalized training regimens.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe even in-game strategies based on real-time data about a player's fatigue level.
Exactly. Imagine a coach being able to track that kind of data during a game. They could make decisions about when to give a guy a rest, how to adjust his role on the ice.
That's kind of crazy to think about. It's almost futuristic.
Yeah.
But I bet that information would be super valuable.
It would be. And think about the implications for injury prevention.
Oh, yeah.
If we can better understand and manage fatigue,
right,
we can keep those guys on the ice and help them stay healthy throughout the season.
Definitely. And we saw how the study found those differences between the demands on defensemen and forwards.
Right.
It makes you wonder if those training and recovery strategies should be different for each position, too.
That's a great point. I think it's a real possibility. Maybe defensemen need a different kind of conditioning program compared to forwards.
Because of all those quick starts and stops?
Right, exactly. And maybe even different nutritional plans to help them recover faster.
It's really fascinating to think about all the possibilities. It's like we're just scratching the surface of what we can learn about fatigue and how it impacts performance.
I know, right?
This whole conversation has really made me think about the coach's role in a whole new way. Like, they're not just calling plays, they're also managing their players' energy levels.
Absolutely, they're fatigue managers.
Right. They got to think about how hard each guy's working, make sure they're not getting too tired.
Yeah.
It's a whole other layer of strategy.
Yeah, it's a lot to juggle. One last thing I wanted to touch on. We've been talking about pro hockey this whole time.
Right.
But do you think these findings, like, are they relevant to other levels of hockey too?
Like youth hockey or like those adult rec leagues.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, fatigue is fatigue, right?
Yeah.
But it might play out differently depending on the level of play, you know?
Totally.
Like those amateur players, they might not have the same level of conditioning or strategic awareness as the pros.
Right. So fatigue might affect them even more.
Yeah.
And those little changes that the study found, they might be more noticeable in those players.
Yeah, exactly. And think about the mental side of it too. Like, the pressure is different in a casual game versus a pro game.
That's true. I know I get way more stressed out playing in my beer league than I ever did in high school.
Yeah, right.
So I guess the point is we need more research at all levels of hockey to really understand the full picture.
I think so, yeah. The more we learn about fatigue, the better we can help all players stay safe and perform at their best.
That's a great point to end on. This has been a really fascinating deep dive, and I think we've all learned a lot about how fatigue works in hockey and what it could mean for the sport going forward.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Science of Hockey. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to share it with your friends, teammates, or anyone who loves hockey as much as you do. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode, and we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment to let us know what you liked, what you'd like to hear next, or any questions you have. Your feedback helps us make the show even better. Until next time, keep your skates sharp, your mind open, and keep chasing the science behind the game.